Start it.
Wink, how are you?
I'm well. I've been running around, but I am well. Thank you. Very well. And I hope you are too.
Well,
I'm trying to
I
prop my phone up so that you can see me, but
okay,
um,
okay.
it's
Uh,
it's primitive. But there we
uh,
are.
it's looking good, looking good. Well, thank you, Wink, for joining us here today. As you know, we had a little bit of a difficulty last week, but we are here today. We're soldering on. By the way, Christian is in the audience, and he got really excited when you showed up there.
Oh, Christian. Hello, Christian. He's Christian Schiller. I thought it was the other Christian, but but there we are. Christian
Yeah,
Schiller. Hello.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, tell me a little bit before we get into the actual, the core subject matter of our discussion today. Tell me a little bit about how you are making out in this lockdown, and any projects that you were able to tell us about that you were pursuing, heavily before they were put on hold by the lockdown, and how are you making out there in the I don't know, in the Alps or foothill of the Alps or wherever it is that you're resting out this lockdown.
Well, I'm very lucky. I'm in what is technically my second home in a chalet in the French Alps,
Mm-hmm.
in a ski resort.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very, very difficult for our ski resort, as it's been difficult for so many people, because literally Saturday night, I think it was the 14th of March, President Macron said, okay, you guys, you're not self-distancing like I asked you to 3 days ago, so I am closing everything. So literally over a weekend, when it was still very much the season, suddenly the whole of the ski area was closed, and the restaurants and bars, but the ski slopes and the ski everything. And it was very weird, and I felt very, very sorry for the shops in the neighborhood and the restaurants and the holiday makers too, who had just arrived for a week's holiday, or were there for a weekend. But for me, it has had very, very little adverse effect. In fact, the contrary, because I live on my own. I'm used to my own company anyway. And in fact, it had the reverse effect. I was less isolated because suddenly everybody else was isolated. So I had more people communicating with me, phoning me and texting me, and than forever. And
Yeah,
I wasn't used to it.
yeah.
So
So
um,
they were becoming a bother to you then. They were upsetting your isolation.
well, I have to say that, we could get into a philosophical conversation about this, but it's been weird, and I've had bad times like everybody does, ups and downs.
Yeah.
But here I am, and I've been here for 6 weeks, and I can't. Well, I did actually get a little delivery of some ham and cheese today, but
Uh,
mostly I can't get deliveries, so I just go out now and again. It's only me to feed, and I'm careful, and I go to local supermarkets and stock up very, very rarely. And I can. We're not allowed to go theoretically for any walks beyond 1 kilometer, so just over half a mile from the house. But you can do a circular walk.
yeah.
I like most people, I cheat a little bit, but what I do not do is go up mountain paths, mountain tracks. I stick to the roads,
Yeah.
because the whole idea is that you don't want anybody having an accident, because emergency services are needed for other things. So everything's great with me in terms of projects. Oh my goodness. Well, I mainly focus on getting up in the morning, feeding myself, meditating, having some exercise, not necessarily in that order,
In that order. Right.
answering a million emails.
Yeah.
What I have achieved, and I'm quite pleased with that, is that my I've done an ebook of my second printed book, an ebook version. So it wasn't me who did the conversion, but there's an awful lot of nitty gritty things that I had to sort out.
Yeah.
And I've managed to do a couple of things on my website so that I could actually upload EPUB versions of both books onto my website so that I get all the money instead of giving it to other
Rather than
people.
um,
So that was an achievement. And otherwise, I frankly, I'm too scared to think of the future.
yeah,
I think it's best to be in the present.
yeah,
So,
yeah. And wait,
yeah.
wait for it. All right. So just before we turn to the core of the topic, I'd like to, before I read your book, the best regional survey or survey of a wine region I had read prior to that was the work by Nesto and Savino, which is called The World of Sicilian Wine. And, and it's my style because it's so detailed. It provides so much information. You come away from that fully understanding the fundamentals of the region. Tell me a little bit about your background, the pedigree that brought you to this point that you could deliver such a tour de force for our readers.
Well, first of all, Keith, thank you for the compliments. I really appreciate that. Um, I think it really was a coming together of several decades of experience.
Mhm,
I've always worked in the world of wine. I
mhm,
started age 20. And so I worked for importers for a while. I had my own little business selling wine for a while, but this is years ago.
mhm,
I soon realized that I was better at communicating than selling.
mhm,
And I started teaching about wine.
mhm,
Um, and I was studying for the Master of Wine at the time.
mhm.
I'm a proud failure. And I'm very proud of it because
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
yeah,
Just to have done it was such a great experience.
yeah.
I studied Master of Wine at the end of the 80s, and in fact I passed the written part, so I have a very solid theoretical knowledge about wines of the world, albeit dated now, of course.
Mhm,
But I got to that point and I didn't pass the tasting, and that
mhm,
didn't hugely surprise me. That was always my weaker part.
mhm,
So I started teaching about wine, and I did a little bit of writing, but it was more teaching. But I also started working just to earn bits of money as a freelance for wine book publishers.
mhm,
The UK has got a fine reputation for wine books. We had all the Mitchell Beasley books, notably Hugh Johnson's Wine Atlas and all of those sorts of things. And I ended up working freelance a couple of days a week for the publishers of Oz Clarke.
mhm,
And so I was doing a lot of background work, a lot of background research. I was working on maps, and I was seeing how the world of publishing worked.
mhm.
And I also made a vow that I would never ever write a book. But you know what vows are
Yeah,
like.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
why did I make that vow? Because I learnt that actually nobody can make money from books, and that actually very, very few are sold. And so and I could see how much work went into them, partly, and that the author was the one who got less money than anybody. I mean, at some point, I think I was earning more money than Oz Clarke just by being paid not a high amount, but an hourly rate
Mm,
for 2 or 3 days a week,
mm,
and because I was working in an office. So that was the publishing experience. So where did Jura fit in? Well, I've always been a skier. This is why I'm right now sitting in a ski resort. So I was lucky enough to be able to invest in a small property in the French Alps to have a second home.
mm,
And so, needless to say, the first thing I did was go and investigate the local wines, which were Savoy wines.
mm,
So, uh, historically, in the editorial world, in the world of books and magazines on wine, Savoy and Jura have always been linked together. In my view, wrongly, but I do understand why. It's mainly for editorial convenience, because you've got two minuscule regions of France. And so if you're doing a book on the whole of France or the whole of the world, and I'm talking of 20 plus years ago, what do you do with these two regions that have both of them appellation Contrôlée wines, and you've got to put them in your book of France somewhere 20 years ago, and they both happen to be in eastern France, and one, the Jura, happens to be northwest of Jura, northwest of Geneva in Switzerland, and Savoie happens to be south of Geneva. So, hey, the publishing mind thinks about this and goes, we can do a map and we can have both of them on there.
Yeah.
So that's great. And hey, aren't they both high altitude? Well, people perceive them to be. They're not, as it happens. But yes, they're mountain wines and they have peculiar appellations. They have peculiar grapes. They must be identical. Let's just stick them together. So, track forward, having changed properties and spending more time here than I was in London, or arguably I wasn't spending more time, but more time than I used to. Out of the blue, I was asked in about 99 to contribute to an encyclopedia of the world and to write the chapter on Jura Savoie Bouger. Well, I knew nothing about Jura. I really didn't know anything. I tasted a vin jaune once. I knew who Henri Mayer was because I'd actually visited there in the early 80s, and that was it. And everybody thinks it's that I live there. And no, I don't. I live up in an upper mountain in Haute-Savoie. And actually, from the top of my mountain in Haute-Savoie, to drive to Arbois, the sort of wine center of the Jura, takes me nearly 3 hours. So, that's not inconsiderable, and it's quite expensive as well, driving in Europe. So, anyway, I took on the challenge and I went and had a visit for a day because I was being paid a pittance. So, I spent the night before and I set up visits with through the regional association with sort of people in each appellation. And by this time, I'd worked in wine for 20 odd years. I by this time lectured on diploma, WSET diploma on the Loire Valley, and I was starting to talk about the New World, and I was pretty experienced. And I came away from my first visit in Jura going, oh my God, I know nothing. I don't understand. This is nonsense. And I didn't fall in love with the wines. I became intrigued. And then a few years later, not many years later, I was given a real break. I was persuaded by Tom Stevenson, the author, to contribute to his, what was a groundbreaking idea of his to do an annual wine guide that was called Wine Report, that existed from the 2004 edition to the 2009 edition. And I became the contributor who wrote on Jura and Savoie, both of them together. And my chapter, because Tom is an interesting person and he doesn't follow the rules necessarily, he gets a lot of liberty. And my chapter was longer than the chapter on Bordeaux. So, whereas my first year I had a big problem visiting producers because I had nothing to show them. And they said, we're not interested in England. And I said, look, this is being sold on something called the internet as well. And, it's and they go, internet, what's that? And I said, well, there's something called Amazon, and books are sold on there. And it's not just for English people, it's for Americans too. And it's for anybody who speaks English. And they said, well, we don't export. We're not interested. And some of them actually refused me a visit, in both regions, both Jura and Savoie. So the next year I had a book to show them. So I would go up and I would go, and by the way, my chapter's longer than the one on Bordeaux. And they'd look at me like I was an alien. And it's just like, what? How can your chapter be longer than the one on Bordeaux?
There must be something wrong with you.
Exactly. So I have to say it was very, very hard for a few years visiting. And I used to do the visits in winter. It was very cold. They were talking to mountain people. They were not very open, and also I happen to be female and English, so that meant they were scared, and what they call journaliste, because
Mm,
in France you have to be in a box.
mm,
You unfortunately, they'd say, well, what do you do? And I would sort of go, my French wasn't fluent but was getting better all the time, and I'd go, well, I'm an educator and I write a little bit about wine and I've contributed to books. And they go, oh, so you're an enologue? And I go, oh, no, 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 I'm not an enologue, because an enologue needs a qualification and I
yeah.
didn't have that. So in the end, I had to be journaliste, which I don't really like, but they do like boxes. So I have to go into that box when needed and be a journaliste. So
Are
it's
you
been a
still in
great
that
challenge.
box? Are you still
Sorry?
in that box? Are you still in that box?
Only when I have to be.
Okay.
Only when I am faced with a French person who I need something from, and I have to explain what I do.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it is still like that in France, that
Mm-hmm.
most people have one career path and do
Mm-hmm.
one thing, and they're more comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done a little bit of journalism, but I don't, I definitely think of myself more as a writer
Right.
now. Right, well,
Yeah.
educator first, writer
Yeah.
second.
Yeah.
So,
So tell me, you started to talk a little bit about the people there. Tell me a little bit about the region, and not as distinct from the wine aspect and the physical characteristics of it. How do you view the region of the Jura region?
it's very much hidden France.
Mm,
It's one of many places in France that are sweepingly called in French La France profonde,
mm,
deep France,
mm,
sort of lost France, if you
mm,
like.
mm,
It is off the beaten track, although there is a freeway, a motorway that comes down from Dijon in Burgundy down towards the Alps. It is sort of off the side of that, and
mm,
most French people would think of the Jura Mountains, which very much make it what it is. The
mm,
Jura Mountains are a lower range than the Alps, and the
mm,
vineyards are on the foothills.
mm,
And it's generally a poor area.
mm,
And the capital town of the department is called Lons-le-Saunier.
mm,
It's in the southern part of the wine region.
mm,
And although when you look carefully at it, you find fascinating buildings and so on, it's a bit of a sad place. It doesn't
mm,
have great shops and restaurants and so on. That you have to go to Arbois for. And
mm,
Arbois is just a delight and has changed massively in the last 15 years that I have known it and been going there regularly.
mm,
Arbois is the place where Louis Pasteur grew up.
mm,
He was born in Dole, which is a beautiful town actually, and used to be the capital before Lons-le-Saunier.
mm,
Dole is to the north, and he was born there, and then he grew up in Arbois, and he loved Arbois, and he kept a house there.
mm,
And even when he became a famous scientist in Paris, every summer he would decamp by train,
mm,
take the train. They had their 2 or 3 months off in the summer,
mm,
and he would take the train with his family down to Arbois, and he
mm,
would bring his laboratory with him,
mm.
his whole laboratory on the train, and he would
Wow.
set up a laboratory in a nearby
Yeah.
house.
Yeah.
And he used the wine cellars, as a form of study to study yeasts and bacteria and all the rest.
Mm-hmm.
He also had eventually his own vineyard, which still exists, and well, it's been replanted, but it still exists. And he did tests on that as well to prove that yeasts could only exist in the presence of oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
So I Arbois is delightful. You can stay in the middle of it. You can walk around without needing to get in a car. You can go and taste at winemakers' shops. It's not the winemakers themselves, no. And they've got better and better restaurants
Hmm.
when they're open.
Hmm.
So a delightful, delightful place, as long as you don't go in January, which is when I used to do nearly all my visits, because I sort of had to, because everything's closed in January.
Okay,
So
that's when you had the best access to the winemakers and things of that nature.
I did, and it fitted the deadlines of Wine Report, and it fitted my time as well. It was when I was sort of based in France and skiing in between and so on. So, but there are huge numbers of gorgeous little villages, but they're very, very, very quiet.
Hmm.
And you really have to have a car to get around. You can't
Hmm.
expect to do it any other way. And even getting cabs and taxis is tricky.
Yeah,
And ideally you need to speak some French.
yeah,
It's so I does that answer a
yeah,
little bit?
yeah, most definitely. Listen, before we
I'm
dig
gonna have a
into the,
sip of wine.
please do tell us what you're drinking.
I'd love to tell you what I'm drinking. I opened this the other night. I opened it on Saturday night when I was doing a webinar for 67 Pall Mall, and many of the people attending this attending this webinar had little bottle samples,
Yeah,
and mine didn't arrive.
yeah,
So I opened some other stuff, and I decided to open old wines. I don't have
yeah,
many,
yeah,
and this is a Trousseau.
yeah,
Um, I'll see if I can show it to you. It's got a delightfully old-fashioned label.
yeah.
Trousseau from Arbois, from the producer Daniel Dugois. And I'll see if I can show you the vintage, which is sort of partly handwritten. The light's wrong for that, but it's 2002. Cuvée de Grevillère, which is the Dugois' best cuvée,
Yeah.
which is an old vineyard that was planted in 1950.
Mm-hmm.
And so even in 2002, these were 50-year-old vines and
Mm-hmm.
aged in big foudre, big oak
Mm-hmm.
for 2 or 3 years. It definitely is tasting like a mature wine,
Yeah,
but it still has got vibrant acidity and some very, very soft tannins. And
yeah,
then it has those rustic flavors that you find in Trousseau.
yeah,
So a bit of fun, but it still needs food. I cut myself a little bit of charcuterie. I've got all the props here because I've
yeah.
also got a vin jaune open as well.
So we have a couple of questions. Let me Anoram asked how common are fully dry wines in Apremont?
Apremont,
Yeah.
which is in Savoie. Okay. Fully dry wines are the commonest among the good producers. But the larger negociants and co-ops and some of the more old-fashioned producers, in other words, those making not such good wines, will
Mm-hmm.
sweeten them up a bit. But
Mm-hmm.
most Apremont should be dry. It's made from the Jacquard grape.
Okay. Second question: has the popularity of red Jura helped or hurt white wines in Jura?
Has it helped the white wine?
Has it helped or hurt the white wines?
I don't understand the question.
The assumption, I guess, going into the question is that the popularity of red Jura wines has either benefited or
Well,
hurt.
the
Yeah.
reality is that the popularity of red Jura wines is confined to some trendy bars in New York and San Francisco, and there isn't a huge popularity of Jura red wines,
Mm-hmm.
except on export markets. And
Mm-hmm.
export is only a very small part of what Jura does.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it is intriguing that and Neil Rosenthal was one of the first American importers to bring in Jura wine from smaller producers. And I wrote the first article I wrote for a US magazine was for Sommelier Journal when it first came out, that journal. And I interviewed him to try and understand the American market better. And he said that he actually went to the Jura to get vin jaune because the top chefs that he was supplying often were French, and they said, we need vin jaune to cook with, but we want a good one because we'd like to drink a bit as well. And they suggested he went to Jacques Pouffenet. And when he was with Jacques Pouffenet, he tasted all the other wines and said, well, I'll take a little bit of everything and see what we can do. And he had absolutely no thought that the red wines would do well, but he
Hmm.
thought he'd try. And they just took off of their own accord, in my view, because I mean, this was in the early 2000s, early and mid 2000s, and they took off because they, in my view, they were diametrically opposed to Parker Reds. You couldn't get further on the other taste register than Parker Reds. So yes, in terms of some of the US importers, it was a door opener for them, but not so much for the producers themselves. And Cremant de Jura is much more of a success story that has helped the whole region, really.
I love that actually. Um, and that raises an interesting point if you can talk to that. But the difference between domestic and export markets as it relates to Jura, but also you wrote this book 6 years ago. Can you talk about the trajectory of Jura wine, both pre and post your book? I know that here in the U.S., especially, Psalms in the major restaurants, Jura was a really, really big deal. And as you say, I thought it was a reflection of them taking ownership of a part of that market because up until that time, you had Parker with his big wines, and this gave them something to hold on to and to make their own, and to for them to bring their customers along with something that was out of the mainstream, so to speak. So you can talk to that a bit, please.
Well, when I first started visiting the Jura, they exported 2% of their production, and most of that was to Belgium and Switzerland. A minuscule amount might have gone to some top restaurants in London, minuscule, mainly vin jaune. They sold very little in Paris. Um, Jokingly, both Jura and Savoie, in fact, both of them describe Paris as being export, and it's like a different country. So everything was sold in the region. So gradually it picked up, and by the time my book came out, I can't remember without looking it up, but I think it was about 10 or 12% of the of the production that was export. And today it's sort of between 17 and 20%. But there are a lot of factors at play here. One of the things that I really, really have to emphasize for those who have not perhaps heard me speak before, and or who've forgotten this figure, it is such an important figure. Jura produces 0.2% of French wine. Okay? That's a tiny, tiny, tiny figure. 10 million bottles in an average year, but we often don't get average years anymore. They had a string of challenging vintages, challenging in all sorts of ways, either spring frost or disease, or summers that are too dry, too hot, they don't have irrigation, so all or too wet, or too this or too that, and all sorts of problems over the years. So 2011 was a normal vintage in terms of quantity and good quality, and the next one after that was 18. So that's a big gap. And so first of all, you have this challenge of very little quantity. And now I'm going to throw some more statistics at you. Some of you might know Australian wines, and one of the things when you learn about Australia is that you learn that about three companies in Australia control 50 or 60% of the wine coming out of Australia. Well, it's just the same in Jura, just the same. Now, I'm not talking about export markets, I'm talking about production.
Mm-hmm.
So you take this tiny, tiny production that they have, and then more than half of it is from three companies. One of them is a big negociant called Maison du Vigneron. Their biggest products are Cremant de Jura. They do export it under lots of different names, and it's very decent indeed. The other big one is the Cave Cooperative, which is over there called a fruitière of Arbois. They have a very decent quality, but it is, after all, a cooperative. And then the third one is Henri Maire, now owned by Burgundians, and that's a long story, and we won't go into that.
Mm-hmm.
So you can immediately sort of say, well, that's half of it. So the other half is divided by 150 companies, 150 wineries, or roughly. So there are very, very small quantities about, and added to the fact that most producers in Jura make at least 15 different wines, and some of them, notably somebody like Stéphane Tissot, who does have a large domain, especially being biodynamic. He has 50 hectares, which is big, very big. But he makes sort of 30, 40 different wines in a typical year. So does Ganva makes even more than that from 8 hectares. Or I think it's 8, it might be 12, I can't remember. And so on. So you drill down, and then you get the US market that wants so much, and the Swedish market that wants so much, the UK market wants so much. Hang on a minute, there's Paris, and then they want to keep their local customers happy because they know that is sensible to keep on local customers in case something goes wrong with exports.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very, very challenging, and that remains the case. And in fact, the big difference since my book came out, sales have gone up, not because of my book, but because more and more people are importing. But it becomes more and more challenging for the producers. They also find it challenging to manage visitors. Some people watching might know how difficult it is to get appointments. And please, please, please don't send me messages saying, how can I get an appointment with? In fact, that was already a problem before I wrote my book, which was one of the reasons I wrote my book, to stop people sending me messages all the time, because I did give some guidance in the book.
Yeah.
But it's very, very, very hard to visit. Even I am refused by top
Yeah.
producers, you
Yeah.
know.
So the prices are reflecting that scarcity, relative scarcity of the wines.
Only for a few producers, only for some big stars. And the prices that you might see over there are very much, added on. If you are in the Jura and you go to a restaurant in the Jura, you'll find a Ganvar wine and Stéphane Tissot wine. You might find an Auvernois wine, and you'll look at the price and you go, oh my goodness, I
Should be
can get
buying a
it for this
suitcase.
price. And that is because the producers like to support the locals and make sure that they get it at the sensible price.
Mm.
But once it goes onto the export market and then the markups come and all the rest and the rest, it's a problem.
Yeah. All right, we have a couple of questions here. Again, from Sarah May. Uh, I'd like to ask Wink for her advice on people who have a passion for a non-famous wine region. How to start if you don't have a name in wine?
Um, to be a producer, or to be a consumer, or to import, or to write, or to, I don't,
Uh,
sorry, I'm being a
yes,
bit.
Sarah May, if you can put some additional clarification on that, we'd be happy to answer that. Then drink what you like. Ask how do you define a not normal, abnormal year in the Jura? Spring frost is a big problem in Virginia, hail, etc., etc.
Yeah, they have all of it. There are years that they have spring frost, and that seems to have been increasing with climate change. The reason for that is that the vines have been starting to develop earlier in the year, so therefore they are more developed. So when frost comes in mid to late April, it can really, really harm the vines. And there have been some years, 17 was really, really bad. It was the 20 something of September twice, 1 week, two bouts a week apart. And they were proper air frosts rather than ground frosts, which are even worse. So that's one big problem. Another problem is getting rain at flowering and getting storms, and then not being able to control the mildew. And that will reduce the crop considerably, especially for good producers. There are random hailstorms as well. That has been a big problem. And occasionally there's been problems with drought in certain years. That's a growing problem as well at the end of the season, which brings down the crop as well. So these all add together to bring down the crop. In terms of quality, though, there have been very, very, very few poor years because amazingly the weather seems to sort itself out when it comes to September or into October. And they nearly always, which was not the case in the past, sort of 30, 40 years ago, they nearly always seem to have a dry harvest and a decent harvest. So, yeah.
So
I
tell me about their winemaking skills. Is it indigenous, or are they getting advice from the Bordelais or the Burgundians or the people in the Northern Rhone? Where
No,
they're capable?
no. I mean, it's about generations. So originally, it was just home homemade learning. Learning from any your father and your grandfather, and then doing it from books and so on. And then for the past, how long will it be? 30 odd years. Nearly everybody would go to wine school. And the most common wine school they would go to would be in Burgundy because it's the closest. So most of them go to Beaune. If they do advanced studies, which a few of them do, then they might go to Dijon or to Bordeaux or to Montpellier, which are the famous enology schools. And these days, some of them, just one or two of the youngsters, are being sent by their parents to Changin in Switzerland, which is a Swiss wine school, to get a different approach. And then some of them will have done harvest through their studies. They do harvests in other places, most of them in France, but a very few have ventured to the New World. It depends on how much money the parents have got as to what they do. But and I would say that the organic producers, who are very much a different band of producers and who work together much more closely than the non-organic producers, the younger generations, there is less jealousy. They have a sort of clique in the best sense, A, between them, but B, with other regions as well, of people working in similar ways to them, especially the natural wine producers. So when they go to wine fairs to sell their wines, which is how a lot of wines are sold in France itself, they sell direct to consumers at wine fairs and wine exhibitions. And there'll be natural wine fairs, many of them, organic wine fairs, and so on. So they'll meet their fellow winemakers from different regions and they'll taste with them, they'll discuss problems, and so on. So that's how it
So,
works.
are the winemakers there? Do they consider the Jura story a success? Are they considering themselves as successful? Number one, and number two, are there? If so, are there any obvious visibility of that kind of success regionally, in terms of investments in equipment, uh, winery and vineyards, things of that nature?
Well, fairly obviously, some of them have been able to reinvest the money they've made, particularly into cellars. Perhaps going down the route of concrete eggs or different barrels. They very rarely buy new barrels.
Hmm.
Investing in vineyards is very, very difficult because planting vineyards is highly controlled in France, and the good sites are all taken.
Hmm.
But yes, they will replant when they can. The vast majority of them don't own their vineyards, they lease them, often on long term lease.
Hmm.
Um, but coming back right to the beginning of your question, no, they don't think they're a success. And no, there are very few signs of success. It's very, very precarious. And it's precarious because of the quantity.
Hmm.
And there doesn't at present seem to be a solution for it.
Hmm.
And in the crisis that we're in now, I have not actually spoken to anybody since right at the beginning, when I had a very difficult conversation with somebody famous who I contacted to see whether I could perhaps help with some online activities, and particularly because le nez dans le vert, which means the nose in the green, which is a pun on words. It's the name of their organic tasting exhibition that they have at the end of March, and this is when you get about 40 producers. It's a fabulous event. 40 producers. On a Sunday it's for consumers, and on Monday morning it's for trade, and that of course was cancelled. And so I knew it was going to be cancelled. I was going to be going there. And that's when I made the phone call. And that's when I just backed off, because the person I talked to was just in a very bad state, very, very worried. How am I? This is the time of year when you need people working in vineyards. And that's what they care about there, is the work in the vineyards. To make good wine, you have to do your work properly in the vineyards. And he said, how am I supposed to get enough seasonal workers, and how am I going to set it up for them to self distance, and I don't want any harm to come to them. They are focused on people and on what matters in life, not about fame and fortune or anything like that. And this is a tiny, tiny area. Success is very, very precarious there.
We have a question from a Wine Talk group, and it goes back to maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago. And she's asking, why don't the producers want tourists in the area?
It's not that they don't want them, it's that they can't cope. The They don't have time to receive them. The top producers, the trendy producers, are often very, very small. They might only have 4 or 5 hectares of vineyards, with 10 acres, give or take, which they manage entirely on their own, perhaps as a couple, with no employees whatsoever, only seasonal labor. So they get seasonal labor for the months from about April until harvest, and that's how they work. So even when I call to visit, they will say, if they say yes, because they realize they do have to see people who are writing, and they also have to see their importers, every single one of them will say to me, do you think you could come at the end of the afternoon? And that means 6 or 7 o'clock for a visit, because they need to work all day.
Yeah.
And so you do have bigger, more commercial estates that have tasting rooms, and those tasting rooms will have somebody working there full time, and they're very aware of wine tourism, but they may not be the trendy producers you want to visit. but it doesn't mean they're bad people. I know, and one of the things I try to do in my book, and not a great deal has changed since then, is say the ones that have a tasting room. I mean, I will give an example right away. Domaine Pinier, who are near Lens-le-Saunier. They are a biodynamic producer, a fabulous biodynamic producer. They just have never become as trendy as certain other ones. But they have a tasting room which is run by the sister. There are two brothers and a sister, and she runs the tasting room along with doing all the admin. So that tasting room is open Monday to Saturday, not at lunchtime, of course, but it is open, and you can go there without an appointment and so on. If you want to meet one of her brothers and talk technical or see the cellars, you'll need an appointment, and that'll be more difficult. But that's just to give you one example. Obviously, you can go to the Arbois Cooperative. They have shops, they have places you can go and taste. And Stéphane Tissot has a fabulous shop in the middle of Arbois. He has somebody highly qualified that runs that shop that can do a tasting of 3 or 4, maybe 6 wines without an appointment. But it doesn't mean you'll get the cuvée that you particularly want to taste. So it's not impossible to go and visit the Jura, but
Yeah.
you have to do it on their terms.
Right. So, and we haven't gotten to anything in the book as yet, and I noticed it's like 150. You're such a phenomenal storyteller, by the way. But just a little off topic. I had a conversation with Yanis Karakassis last week, and he was talking about the natural wine appellation that has recently been introduced there in France. And so I wanted to get your take on it. And one of his concerns was that he was hoping that other European countries would adopt that, so that there'd be not as much an opportunity for confusion across the region. So could you talk to that?
Not much, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I, I have to be honest. I've scanned through it.
Yeah.
I haven't had a chance to speak to producers because I haven't been seeing producers. I think my biggest concern would be that very few of them will bother to adopt it, and they don't really care.
Yeah.
And so I agree that it needs to be across different countries.
Mhm.
But it's a very, very difficult one to get everybody to agree.
Great.
And it's the difficulties of whether you insist on organic growing and whether people should have an organic certification first of all. And obviously the knotty problem of sulfur dioxide. I'd also like to mention chaptalization or enrichment, adding sugar to must, to grape juice. This is something that is normal in my other region, which I hope you're going to invite me back to talk more about Savoie.
Yes.
But
Yeah. Yes.
in
We
Savoie,
did. Yeah.
enrichment is almost essential for certain grape
Yeah.
varieties.
Yeah.
And yes, there's a couple of natural wine producers who are not doing it
Yeah.
and making very low alcohol wines, but
Yeah.
there are too many questions at the moment. I'm pleased that it's being debated, and I'm pleased that it's there, but
Wonderful.
that's about it.
Okay, so we have because Instagram will drop us exactly on the hour. If you could use the next 7 minutes just to give us an overview of the wines in the region, just a top level view,
In
and you
seven
mentioned,
minutes?
yeah, and you mentioned before that the Comment you thought was one of the successes. If you can elaborate on that a little bit, the Comment de Jura.
Oh, the Cremant de Jura. Yeah,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
Apremont. I thought you said Apremont.
no,
Oh, Cremant.
yeah.
Yeah, Cremant de Jura is a big success because there was always a tradition of making sparkling wine there, but until the Cremant laws, they adopted the Cremant laws. It was hard to market it, and everybody there were very mixed quality, and I think the Cremant rules helped the quality come up.
Mhm.
Most Cremant is a pure Chardonnay. and it really does give Cremant de Bourgogne a run for its money.
Mm-hmm.
My only criticism would be that some of them are sweetened a little bit too much, but with the dosage being a little bit too high. But that's, again, never forget that they are selling primarily in the region, and that's what people in the region want. But if you go to the top producers, then they'll be more likely to do a Brut Zero and so on. And some of them will blend in a little bit of Pinot, sometimes a little bit of Sauvignon. The rules are very complicated, and to have 7 minutes to talk about every wine style is not possible,
Mm-hmm.
Keith.
Yes. Yeah. No. No. Yeah.
Not possible. So it accounts for over a quarter of the production of the region. So then there are reds, three great varieties: Trousseau, Pulsar, Pinot Noir, very, very occasionally blended together, but nearly always sold as single varietals. Pulsar, also called Plusar, same grape, two names, is a very pale and modern producers, modern, young, trendy, natural wine producers do it with no sulfur. It's a very reductive grape, and do it with a lot of carbonic maceration. This means it may not age. Traditionally, it would be made to be aged, and it would be, but not usually aged in oak. Trousseau, well, I'm drinking one that is sort of 17 years old, that was aged in Foudre. There are all sorts of different Trousseaus. It's indigenous to the region as well, but it is the same as Bastardo in Portugal. There's a weird thing. And Merensau in Ribera Sacra in Spain, and a few other synonyms. Pinot Noir, don't dismiss it. It can be good, but quite a lot of it is used for Cremant and for Macvin, which is a very odd fortified wine of sorts, a vin de liqueur, which is mainly made from Chardonnay grain. But white wines are the stars there, absolutely. There are Chardonnays that give Burgundy a run for their money. Really, really stunning Chardonnays, terroir-specific Chardonnays that have changed out of all recognition in the last 15, 20 years. There are some simpler ones that are just sort of equivalent of a Macon. But there's a strong terroir characteristic that comes through, a sort of earthy character, a mineral character, very, very varied. And then the wonderful Sauvignon, which is the grape for Vin Jaune, which is the famous wine of the Jura. Only 5% of Jura's wine production is Vin Jaune. It is made from exclusively the Sauvignon variety, but you can use Sauvignon for all sorts of different wine styles as well. But the oxidative Vin Jaune has very strict rules. It stays about 6 years under a veil of yeast in an old barrel in cellars that are upside down, in that they vary in temperature.
Yeah.
So, it's a whole thing.
Yeah.
Which is
And
why I had to
we
write 352 pages.
right, and exactly. And so for those who we didn't get into any of the details in the book, but please buy it and understand what I'm talking about is this being one of the better. By the way, a lot of pictures in there, a lot of photographs. Is that
Yeah,
yeah? Okay.
I there are 200 odd photographs. There's also extraordinary maps that I had
The
commissioned.
maps are phenomenal. The
Well,
maps are
they were
absolutely.
they were done by Quentin Sadler, who now does
He's a
stuff
good
for
guy,
Wine
by the way. Yeah,
Scholar Guild.
yeah,
He's a lovely, lovely friend and colleague of mine. We've
yeah,
known each other as wine educators for years, and we worked on them together. I mean, he obviously did them, but I
yeah.
decided what I wanted in them and how to do them. The photographs are by Mick Rock, who is somebody I've known for years. He's not the same Mick Rock as the photographer who took pictures of the Stones and lots of rock musicians, even though he's of the same era. He's a
Yeah.
wine specialist photographer, and also my late partner Brett took a lot of photographs as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
So they're all in there. The main thing is I really want to say before we run out of time is, you won't find this book easily on Amazon, although there's a Kindle version. Please buy it direct from me. I ship all over the world, and I'm on winetravelmedia.com. So you'll find it there.
Excellent. Thank you. On that note, we'll, so, we don't have a hard crash out. Thank you so very much, Wink. And for everyone, we'll be getting together again next week, either Monday or Tuesday. We'll alert you guys as to it to discuss her newer book. Thank you very much,
Savoir
Wink.
book. Yeah.
Savoir book. This has
French
been
Alps.
excellent. Thank
Thank
you
you,
very
Keith.
much.
Brilliant. Okay.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye.
Thanks for all the comments. I'll look at them later.
All right.
Yeah.